Some old and some new faces in Canada's new cabinet. Sri Lankan Canadians remember the end of a war. And a funeral for Pakistan's bomb victims. Hello and welcome to Omni News South Asian Edition. I'm Angie Seth. Today, May 18th, marks the second anniversary of the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. Now, while the Sri Lankan government is showcasing the sense of normalcy that has returned to the country, others, including many Tamils and even human rights groups, are pushing for an inquiry into alleged war crimes. Today, a group of Tamil Canadians are gathering together for a candlelight vigil outside Queen's Park to remember those who died during a long and brutal war. Ada Halim brings us the latest.
Samuel Nithyananthanan was born in Sri Lanka but raised in Canada and vividly remembers what it was like not knowing if his family was safe back home during the 2009 Civil War.
You're left without any hope of doing anything because you're all the way here, and this is why Tamils took tens of thousands of them took the streets trying to call on the government to say, hey, let's stop what's happening. It is a genocide. It is human rights violations. Let's get together and stop it.
He was one of several hundreds of Tamil Canadians who gathered outside Queen's Park this evening.
We're taking this opportunity on the second anniversary of the end of the war in Sri Lanka, again, to reaffirm our commitment to international justice, to reaffirm our commitment to seeking an international inquiry into what exactly happened during the last stages of the conflict. And this would be in line with similar tribunals that have been set up for Rwanda and Yugoslavia.
A UN-commissioned report estimates between 40 to 75,000 civilians were killed during the 2009 conflict, and the gathering here vows to never forget those who lost their lives.
The UN panel assigns blame on both parties for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but it does add a caveat there that says most of the responsibility for the international violations were committed by the Sri Lankan government's armed forces.
But the Sri Lankan Consul General believes some groups are using the UN-requested report to their advantage.
I request the Sri Lankan communities abroad not to be trapped in these kind of propaganda activities.
Sri Lanka has appointed a committee to conduct its own inquiry, and the Consul General is concerned these type of rallies are a way to revive the Tamil Tigers.
Even though LTT has been defeated militarily in the Sri Lankan grounds, there are elements in the outside Sri Lanka who are still willing to create trouble for Sri Lankan communities. They are trying to manipulate these kind of reports in order to gather some fundraising.
Both sides say despite being at odds on whoever is to blame for the past, they are committed to expedite the country's post-conflict reconciliation process. Ada Halim, Omni News, Toronto.
Now, as we just mentioned, it has been 2 years since the separatist conflict in Sri Lanka came to an end. And it ended after the Sri Lankan military cornered the Tamil Tigers in a narrow strip of land in the northeast of the island. They then destroyed the leadership. But just how the war was conducted by both sides of the conflict has been a subject of immense international scrutiny.
The final stages of the more than 25-year-long conflict was intense, but conducted beyond the reach of media. Only images such as these released by the Sri Lankan government and the occasional smuggled-out video purportedly coming out of the war zone gave a glimpse of the war and its effect on the tens of thousands of civilians trapped inside the war zone. There had been concerns about widespread shelling of the area by the Sri Lankan military, while the Tigers were accused of shooting civilians trying to flee the war zone. These are acts that for some experts constitute war crimes. And human rights groups such as Amnesty International and even UN agencies such as the High Commissioner for Human Rights had been pressing for an impartial inquiry into these allegations. And last year, the UN Secretary General appointed an experts committee to advise him on whether international law was upheld during the conflict. The report was released this year and was in many ways shocking. The report lent credibility to charges that the government troops shelled civilian targets, such as hospitals. The Tamil Tigers, meanwhile, were also accused of targeting civilians. The Sri Lankan government has been furious over the report and its publication. On May 1st, the government called for people to protest to show their opposition to the report and the United Nations. Sri Lanka says the UN panel did not have the mandate to issue such a report and also points out to its own committee that is holding hearings on the war. Besides, it is also pointing out that the defeat of the world's most powerful and ruthless rebel group, classified as terrorist groups by many countries, including Canada, should be welcomed, and the world should take notice that Sri Lanka has moved on.